toutes et à tous.
Good morning. I would like to thank the organizers of the ATHS Congress to ask us to participate in this session dedicated to opioids in the international situation you all know, with major overdoses in some areas, especially in North America, not only in Europe too, in Africa, with other molecules, and also in Oceania. The objective of this session is to take stock of the situation with several presentations with international data and French data. We're going to be able to see if we can try, us in France, to prevent such a phenomenon, which is not as major as it is in North America, but that we should prevent instead of curing, when you see how difficult it is to reduce these overdoses. We have 4 presentations. We're going to start with, for the second time, we're going to hear Dr. Montoya from NIDA, who is going to present the medical research to address the opioid crisis in the United States. You have the floor.
Okay. Well, here we go, the second time. Again, I want to thank the organizers for the invitation. It's always wonderful to come here, and the great hospitality of the group here is fantastic. So I'm going to talk about what is the situation of what is being called the opioid crisis in the United States, or the opioid epidemic, as the epidemiologists call it. And I'm just going to give very briefly some statistics and then mostly discuss what is currently being done. So this is the map of the United States, and this is a heat map, and what is being represented here in blue is like the estimated age-adjusted death rate per 100,000 people. And this is in 1999. Blue is colored like less than 2, and then it keeps increasing until it goes to red when it's more than 30. So here is 1999, and here is 2016. As you can see, most of the map of the United States is in red, with very high age-adjusted death rates due to opioids. So with this information, and this is the number of people that are taking or misusing opioids in the United States. More than 10.3 million people of age 12 and older have been using opioids, and of those, 9.3 million people with pain relief misuse, 9.9 people pain relief misuse, and 97 of opioid misusers, about 506,000 people pain relief misuse and heroin use, 800,000 people with heroin use, and about 302,000 people with heroin use only. So those are like dramatic statistics. Perhaps the most dramatic of all of them and the most concerning of all of them is this figure that is representing the deaths per 100,000 population. So this is the deaths due to natural and semi-synthetic opioids like oxycodone and hydrocodone, heroin, and synthetic opioids like fentanyl. So those numbers are really a reason for big, huge concern in the United States. So what has been done? And so this is a press release that was just published on Thursday of last week. This is announcing to the world that NIH has now received $945 million in research to tackle the national opioid crisis through the HEAL initiative. A very large proportion of this money came to NIDA to support research looking at new medications to treat opioid use disorders. And this is what I'm going to be discussing. So there are approximately 375 awards have been given to 41 states to accelerate scientific solutions. I think this is I know that I'm biased because I work in research, but at the same time, I think this is a very clever idea to tackle the epidemic by improving the funding and doing more research, looking at new treatments for opioid use disorders. So what is being done with all this money? And because that money is already, as of last Monday, all that money was already allocated, and research is now ongoing with that money. So it's, again, it's a significant amount of money that is not, this is almost $1 billion that is going to be carried out over the next 5 years. So it's going to be in total about $2.5 billion for opioid research and for pain research also. So that means that we are going to see a lot of new science that is going to be the result of all this funding. So what is all these projects have been funded through what is called the HEAL program. The HEAL stands for Helping to End Addiction Long Term, and this is a program that was developed by Francis Collins at the NIH level with, of course, NIDA's help, with Nora Volkov's help, and many of us have been involved in this program. And the idea is to have an aggressive trust-agency effort to speed scientific solutions to the national opioid public health crisis. And it's built on extensive, well-established NIH research, including basic science, clinical studies to develop safer and more effective treatments for opioid use disorders and pain, and implementation science to develop and test treatment models. So this is a schematic view of the program. So this, as I mentioned, there are two areas. One is the pain management, and the other is treatment, improving the treatment of opioid use and misuse and addiction. And each one of those programs is accelerating the basic science and the clinical science for pain research. And for opioid addictions, we have expanding therapeutic options, new prevention and treatment strategies for opioids, optimize effective treatments, and enhance treatments for affected newborns, specifically for neonatal opioid abstinence syndrome. So what are we doing at NIDA? So those are the projects that NIDA is involved in. One, as I mentioned, is the expanding the therapeutic options for opioid use disorders and overdose. So I'm going to concentrate on discussing this program. That's what this is all. But we have also, through this program, have been enhancing the clinical trials network. This is a program that has been going on at NIDA for almost 20 years, and it's a network of many clinical investigators throughout the country doing mostly implementation and dissemination research. There's a very large program calling, the name is Healing Communities Study. It's a study at different states in the United States, working at the community level with the idea of disseminating treatments and improving the quality of the treatments in those communities. There's also a big project in the justice system. It's called the Justice Community Opioid Innovation Network. The acronym is JCOIN, and this is a large project in jails and in the criminal justice system. There's also a program for prevention, and the last one is the Healthy Brain and Child Development Study. So maybe you have heard of the ABCD study that is being funded by NIDA in collaboration with other institutes. The ABCD study is the largest cohort study of adolescents looking at brain and cognitive development in adolescents and looking at the effects of drugs on the adolescent brain. So the Healthy Brain and Child Development Study is a similar study, but it's going to be a cohort of newborns that is going to be followed over time to do not only neurobehavioral testing, but also some brain imaging. And you know that it's very challenging to do brain imaging in newborns, but that's the idea of this very innovative and revolutionary study. So those are the big projects that NIDA is involved. And as I said, I'm going to be discussing the first one, expanding the therapeutic options for opioid use disorders. So as you most likely know, those are the FDA-approved medications for opioid addiction and overdose in the United States: methadone, buprenorphine in different formulations, sublingual, monthly injection, 6-month implant, naltrexone, oral and monthly. Lofexidine is an alpha-2 agonist that is approved in the United States and also, I think, in the UK. And naloxone, parental and intranasal naloxone. So we have the ones that are in red are medications that NIDA has been closely involved in the development and also in close interaction with the FDA. We work very closely with the FDA in trying to get medications approved for the treatment of opioid use disorders, and those are some of our accomplishments over the years. So, but we're not in good shape. We know, and for those of you who are clinicians, know better than anyone that most patients relapse, patients don't stay in treatment, the medications that we have are not sufficiently effective, we don't have the NNTs, the number needed to treat for those medications like what being presented for alcohol, but if we had that, we knew that was going to be very low. So we need new, more user-friendly formulations of the existing medications. We also need longer duration and more powerful overdose treatments. We also need new approaches to reverse respiratory depression. Respiratory depression is what kills the people who overdose with opioids, because the opioids in general have very little cardiovascular effects, except for the QT prolongation of some of them, but in general, the biggest concern is respiratory depression. The other area is the immunotherapy, or vaccines and monoclonal antibodies to prevent and treat opioid use and relapse and overdose, and develop new targets and approaches to treatment opioid use disorders. So I'm going to discuss each one of them in some detail, what right now is being funded. I just want to also say that my presentation is not going to include everything that has been funded. I'm just going to give you some idea of what is being funded, the research that is coming up, and some of the new studies that are being developed. As I said, this is something, the last group of grants was funded just last week, and I don't have all the data from all the grants in my presentation, but I'm going to give you a flavor of the most important studies that are being funded with this initiative. So first, it was a new formulation of existing medications. So the idea is to have, retention and treatment and treatment adherence to the medications is very low, and especially with the opioid antagonists like naltrexone. We know that oral naltrexone, the retention is very poor, and as a result, the long-acting formulation of naltrexone was developed as a relapse prevention in people who have been detoxified from opioids. And right now, through this HEAL initiative, we are funding 3 formulations of opioid antagonists. One is a 6-month naltrexone formulation. Some of you may be familiar with this. Naltrexone is developed by Go Medical Pharmaceuticals in Australia, and this is a study in collaboration with Columbia University. There's also another study with a 3 formulation of a naltrexone implant with a company called BioCorex, and a 6-month formulation of namelphine with a company is Titan Pharmaceuticals. Titan Pharmaceuticals is the company that worked with us previously in the development of the 6-month formulation implant of buprenorphine. So now they are working on the 6-month implant of the opioid antagonist namelphine. Now, long-term opioid receptor agonist, the work is being done on the weekly oral buprenorphine using a new technology. It's a pill that has like some physical properties that stay in the stomach longer. We know that buprenorphine has pretty low oral absorption. But through this approach, this physical approach, buprenorphine stays longer in the stomach, and then it's possible to have a treatment with on a weekly basis. Another study that is being funded and is currently going on is also a weekly formulation of the R-methadone. As you know, methadone has different isomers, and the R-methadone, which I think is available here in Europe, is safer than the regular methadone because it has apparently less QT prolongation. So with this formulation, we are taking advantage of a safer methadone and making it into a weekly formulation. The other approach is longer duration for more powerful overdose reversal formulations. That includes an intranasal formulation of namelphin opioid antagonist, and this is being developed by a company, Opioid, that is a company that I was working before with a company that developed the intranasal formulation of naloxone, and they work very closely with us. Now we are working on this project with them in developing this intranasal namelphin. It is naloxone. One of the problems of naloxone when you treat patients with opioid overdose, especially in those cases where they overdose with fentanyl or drugs that are more potent or have longer effect, is that the effect of naloxone is very short. So with this one, namelphin apparently has better effects against those synthetic opioids, and at the same time is going to have longer effect and protect more. The other compound that is new or actually is not new, is an old compound that we are resuscitating, is methocinamox. We kind of abandoned it a little bit, but now through this initiative, we are funding it again. It's a long-acting, pseudo-irreversible mu-opioid antagonist. It's similar to naltrexone, but it has less affinity as an antagonist of the opioid receptor, so it's possible that it's going to be, it also has a longer action as an oral formulation. So this is another option. The nafamostat is an opioid delivery system, is a bioactivated molecular delivery prodrug for oral overdose protection. And the last one is the NRS 033, is a namelphin prodrug that is active for 28 days. New approaches to reverse respiratory depression. One of them is almitrin. You have it here in Europe. It's a peripheral stimulating the chemoreceptors at the carotid bodies to enhance respiration. It is used for the treatment of COPD. And we are now testing it to prevent and to treat and to reverse respiratory depression. The other group of compounds that is being tested are the ampakines. Those are mediators of the respiratory drive through the AMPA glutamatergic receptor. And the last one is repinopiptan, which is a full agonist of the 5-HT1A receptor. Novel medications, so new approaches. One is Kindolor. This is a peripherally active, targeting the receptors NaV 1.7 and 1.8. Those are voltage-sensitive sodium channel receptors, and they also work on the NMDA receptor and the glycine site of antagonist. So apparently it's very good for pain, and it has no abuse liability, and it can prevent at least the initiation of opioid use disorders. The other compound is ITI-333. Is a high affinity for the mu-opioid receptor, partial agonist. It also has 5-HT2A and D1 receptor antagonism. So it's kind of like buprenorphine. It's a partial agonist, but it's a little bit improved because it has apparently more antidepressant effects and perhaps more reward blocking properties. It is being tested. The D24M is a mu-opioid receptor and delta opioid receptor heterodimer antagonist, and this compound, the MEV166 and 1170, those are biased mu-opioid receptor agonists. Now, in terms of repurposed medications, and we heard also this morning about the importance of repurposing medications. There are multiple medications that are right now being tested through this HEAL initiative. This is a list that is not complete. I insist, I don't have all the data in this presentation, like guanfacine, suvorexant, the orexin-1 antagonist that I mentioned before, duloxetine, ketamine. The data with ketamine seems to be quite promising. Lorcaserin is also included. Gabapentin as an anti-nociceptive drug that may help to reduce the need for opioids. And we also have dronabinol and cannabidiol that were also discussed in the previous presentations. Okay. And immunotherapies is a very important area in NIDA, vaccines and monoclonal antibodies, and you can see vaccines to improve the safety and efficacy of medications as treatment alone and in combinations. And we have Sandy Comer here, who is also being funded through this program to develop an anti-opioid vaccine at the clinical level. So we are very excited to have the first anti-opioid vaccine that is going to be tested in humans. And we also have multiple other vaccines, including and also an anti-fentanyl monoclonal antibody that is being tested. New approaches, I'm not going to go into details, we can read them here, and many of them, and there will be many more with the new group of grants that were funded. I just want to give a little bit of what we call promising or encouraging news. This is data that I got from the National Survey of Drug Use and Health from 2018, where I got made the slides from the previous presentation. And this is data from heroin use. You can see from 2002 to 2016, approximately big increase. And now in 2018, we see a little bit of decrease here. And this is the data on prescription opioid analgesic. In the past year, we also are seeing a trend towards decreasing. So this seems to be good indication that maybe, hopefully, this opioid crisis is passing, and we have, in the field of addiction, we know that many addictions come and go, and we hope that not only because of all those initiatives and all the work that is being done, not just by NIH or NIDA, but many agencies in the government to control this opioid crisis, we hopefully are seeing good results now. So we think that this is a great initiative. NIDA and NIH, we are very helpful that we receive all this money from the government to support this research. And so I can predict that in the very near future, we are going to have new medications, new approaches to treat opioid use disorders and to help more patients with those disorders. Thank you again for your attention. And
merci. Thank you very much for your presentation. On va continuer avec la présentation suivante.
We're going to continue with the next presentation. For the second time this morning, we're going to listen to Wim van den Brink. He's going to discuss the potential threat for Europe of this American overdose epidemic and the influence of non-European consumption. So you have the floor.
Is it going? No, it's okay. Just wait.
Okay. So thanks again for being here the second time in the morning. And I'm going to try to give you some idea what's going in America, what's going on in Europe, and then I say a few words what's going on in the Netherlands. Why do I end with the Netherlands? Because I have the best overview there. So I'm very curious what I can see in France, and we have speakers that will talk about the situation in France. So let's move on very quickly. Here it's important that you know that I have contacts with the pharmaceutical industry, including, but after the epidemic started, including companies that were strongly involved in the opiate epidemic, like Mundi Pharma. But I'm also involved in the advisory boards of opiate pharmaceuticals that is actually working on finding solutions. So You have to take that into account if I talk to you. So, first of all, I would like to say what I'm going to talk about. I would like to summarize the American situation in terms of use, abuse, treatment, and overdose deaths. Then move to Europe as far as we know the data from Europe. Also in the same terms in the use of prescription opiates and other opiates, abuse, treatment demand, and overdoses, and then to the Netherlands, and then see whether we can find similarities, differences, and whether we can explain these similarities and differences. Oh, this is... So this is the situation in the United States, and this is just a picture that shows the increase of consumption of prescription opiates over the period between 1980 and 2015. And here you see the United States, here you see Australia, and here you see Europe. We're very modest in terms of the use and the prescription of prescription opiates. If you look at the United States, and I think for me this was quite shocking to know that in the United States in 2015, actually the last year prevalence, the number of people who were using prescription opiates in the United States was 40%, 92 million people. And in terms of misuse, it was about 12.5 million. So I will show the data of Europe and the Netherlands also, but I was quite shocked that 40% of the adult population in the last year was using a prescription opiate. And then you see an increase in the use of prescription opiates in the US, and that goes together with an increase of heroin overdose here, but it started with an increase in prescription overdose deaths. Here you see 6 per 100,000 or 60 per million, a huge increase in prescription opioid overdose deaths until 2010. Then you see it stabilized the prescription opioid overdose deaths, and then heroin overdose deaths started to increase again. This is on a broader scale what you see in the number of deaths from opioid drugs in the United States. You saw in 2002 it was 12,000 people. It went up and up and up and up, and by now, actually, in 2017, it was about 60,000, which means, because 60,000 but it means about 170 every day. So these are huge numbers in terms of opiate epidemic and opioid crisis. This is a crisis. More important thing, actually, is that it started with overdose deaths due to prescription opiates, but then from 2010-11 it was heroin again, and since 2013 it's the fentanyl and other fentanyls. And of all the overdose deaths, a large proportion now is not due to prescription opiates, not due to heroin, illicit heroin, but to illicitly manufactured fentanyls. So this is the new epidemic. And this is probably not easy to read, but in 2010, 69% was due to overdose deaths was due to prescription overdose deaths, whereas in 2016, this was only 40%. And you see the change was actually from 2010, synthetic opiates, fentanyls was 14%, and in 2016, it was already half of the overdose deaths was due to synthetic opioids, read fentanyls. This is the same, showing the same thing. This is in Massachusetts. The increasing proportion of opioid overdose due to fentanyl from 44% in 2014 to 76% in March 2016. So you see the opioid overdose that is being largely caused by illicitly manufactured fentanyls. So that's the summary. Since the late 1990s and the early 2000s, enormous increase in prescription opiates use in the USA. In 2015, almost 40% of American population was using an opiate and 4% of the population was misusing. Since 2010, heroin, and since 2013, fentanyl are replacing prescription opiates in especially the number of overdose deaths. So how did that develop further? This is Canada. You see the same dramatic situation, and here again what you see is the enormous increase of fentanyl. Fentanyl also. Fentanyl was involved in 68%, 2/3 of all the opiate overdose deaths. So what is the European situation? This is the same data that I showed for America and Australia and Europe. And you see here, you see a little bit more other things. You see the world is here, Europe is here, and you see there is differences. The UK, you see quite a lot of prescription opioids. Germany, less than Netherlands and Finland. If you go to, these are data, I couldn't find any more recent data, 2012, that was already in the upgoing use of prescription opiates. You see that for Europe, one more, for Europe you can see that we had 12,000 daily doses in 2012 of all opiates, and oxycodone was about half of that. In the United States, you see it's about 4 or 5 times as much, and that is also true for oxycodone, and in Canada it's about 3 times as much in Europe. So we're happily lagging behind in Europe, at least in 2012. If you look not at the prescription of prescription opiates, but in the number of high-risk opiate users, I can say from the EMCDDA that the conclusion is that the number of high-risk opiate users is stable at a rate of about 0.1 to 0.6% of the population. So no increase of the number of high-risk opiate users in Europe. If you look at the number of overdose deaths in Europe, I think you can see from here that it's all, let's see, go back. You can see here the overdose deaths. It's very stable over time, 2006 to 2018. It's very stable. All the overdose deaths to drugs, it's about 8,000. And of these, it's about 80% is opiate overdose deaths. So it seems that it's very stable in Europe, at least until 2016, no large increase. This is, if you see, compare that to the situation in the United States. So we in Europe, what is we in Europe? But we in Europe have about 8,000 overdose deaths on 500 million people, which is 16 per million, whereas the United States has 64,000 deaths in 320 million, which is 200 per million. So this is a factor of 12. So we have overdose deaths, but it's much lower than in the United States. This is the drug overdose deaths per million in some high-level countries where the numbers are pretty high. And this is high numbers you see, and an increasing in the overdose rates in Estonia, the green one here, Sweden, you see here, and Norway. This is worrisome, I think, not well understood. This is Scotland. So although I said overall overdose deaths due to opiates are stable in Europe, but there are some places that I mentioned, Estonia and Norway, but this is Scotland. This looks very serious. If you look at Scotland, you see that the drug overdose deaths, it's special. It's 43% overdose deaths are due to heroin or morphine, but 45% to methadone. So there's a special situation there. And if you look at the increase of the number of overdose deaths, this is the number per million population. And you see they go up to 200 per million, which is the number of the United States. So although on average in Europe, we seem to be in a reasonable, quiet situation, there are areas in Europe where it seems that there is coming an opiate overdose epidemic, and Scotland is one of them. It is Scotland and not the whole of the UK. These are data on opiate consumption. You see This is the increase in the US, and this is the increase in the UK. It started much later, and it's on a lower level, but it's only until 2010. And here you see the overdose deaths in the UK. And you see it's still low and stable. Now, that's only to 2008, and so the newer data till 2017 show basically the same thing, that it has increased, but it's quite stable on a level of about 30 per million, which is a little higher than the rest of Europe, but still much lower than in Scotland. So Scotland seems to be a special place in Europe. This is another issue. In the United States, you saw that the epidemic moved from prescription opiates to heroin overdose deaths to fentanyl overdose deaths. This is a paper that is on the use of fentanyls in Europe. And the highest prescription in Europe is here in Germany and Austria. And the lowest, you see, it's in Estonia, Bulgaria. Interesting, although the prescription, the legal prescription of fentanyls is very low in Estonia, as you can see here. They have the highest fentanyl overdose rate. And this is not officially prescribed, but that is illicitly manufactured fentanyls, probably coming from Russia. This is some other data on fentanyl, and I just showed them because there's not a lot of data around, but we have to be careful here. Here there is Sweden. There is an increasing number of illicitly manufactured fentanyl overdose deaths since 2011, although it's still a small proportion of the total number of overdose deaths. This is Estonia. And you see here, overdose deaths are mainly, 80% is caused by fentanyl, illicitly manufactured overdoses to fentanyl. And in the UK, you see there is an increase of overdose deaths in fentanyl, mainly in elderly patients. I think the most worrisome is the one from southern Germany, Bavaria. And here you see it is prescribed fentanyl that is causing overdose deaths since, say, 2006. So it's not illicitly manufactured, but it's the legally prescribed overdose deaths that occurred since 2006 until 2014. I must say, of all the overdose deaths in 2014, it was about 33% of all the overdose deaths. But since then, it's stabilized, and it might go down from here on in the southern part of Germany. Maybe they saw what's going on. Overall, in the EU, we have very few fentanyl overdose deaths. We had, between 2013 and 2016, we had 160 synthetic opiate overdose deaths, which is less than 1% of all the opiate-related overdose deaths. So fentanyl in Europe is not a real issue, although there are some pockets in Europe where we have to be careful both with legally prescribed fentanyl and illegally produced fentanyl, like in Estonia. So how is with treatment? This is the treatment situation in the EU. We have 1.3 million high-risk opiate users, and we have about 628 people in treatment, which means that in Europe about 48% of all the high-risk heroin users are in opiate maintenance treatment, which is about 13% in the United States, but that will go up after the HEAL program. This is how it's shown in the different countries in Europe. You see in the US it's probably about 13%, and we have much higher rates of high-risk opiate users in treatment. What is the kind of treatment? They're treated basically for heroin addiction, and only a few are treated for fentanyl, buprenorphine, or methadone, with the exception, of course, of Scotland. So that's very different also. The EU 80% of all the people in treatment are in treatment for heroin addiction, where in the USA only 35% is in treatment for heroin addiction, about 65% for prescription opiates. So that's a summary of the European situation. I will not do that. I will show that in a minute. What's the situation in the Netherlands? I can be a little bit more certain about these data. We're low in the number of prescription opiates that are being prescribed as painkillers, but this is a paper that we just, I think a month ago, published in Lancet Public Health. What we see here is that we have a huge increase in prescription opiates in the last 10 years. You see, we started with about 500,000 per 100,000, 500 per 100,000 prescriptions of oxycodone, and that went up to 2,500 per 10,000, 100,000, which, and it seems that it's stabilizing, but see, it's increased 5 times of the original prescription rate. So we're going up quite dramatically, and the same is actually for fentanyl. Fentanyl is going up with a factor 2 from a total of 500 to about 1 million people using. If we look at hospitalizations, the people who come to the hospital for an opiate intoxication, you see, we also see a problem. Like for heroin, we don't see many more patients. It's stable, the number of people who come to hospital with an overdose or an opiate intoxication. The number of people coming with prescription opiates is actually increasing quite dramatically in the last, say, 5-6 years. So I think there's a clear signal there. If you look at the numbers that are in treatment, we don't see a large increment in contrast. We see a reduction of the people in treatment, in number in treatment for heroin dependence. It's slowing down gradually from 70 per 100,000 to now about 45 or 50 per 100,000. But you see there is an increase in people who come for opiate dependence treatment due to prescription opiates. Now you have to be careful. This is the y-axis runs from 0 to 800. Here it runs from 0 to 6. So it's a small increase, but it's a signal. It's a signal that we see these people now, and we see them increasingly. And finding here, you see the mortality caused by opiates in the Netherlands. And you see for heroin, the red one, it's very stable. Low numbers of overdose deaths due to heroin. But you see, since 2014, we see an increase, not dramatic. It looks very steep, but the absolute numbers are relatively small. But you see an increase of overdose deaths. Of course, you have to take into account that we're an increasing population, but this is reported by 100,000, so that doesn't. And we have an increasing elderly population, so that might be also one of the reasons. But it's more likely that we're really starting to see more overdose deaths due to prescription opiates. So, in terms of overdose deaths, what I showed you, we're now here at 6 per million inhabitants. If you look at the USA, it's about 100 to 200 per million inhabitants. And so the Netherlands is here somewhere in the middle of Europe. So to summarize the whole situation, this is probably then, you have all the numbers in your head, and you can ask me the data if you want. But this is the situation in the United States at this moment, in Europe and in the Netherlands. And I'm very curious where this new column of France will be. Opiate painkiller prescription in the general population, as I showed, in 2015 it was 38% of the American population in the last year. In Europe, it's about 5 to 20% of people using prescription opiate as painkillers in the last year, and in the Netherlands is somewhere in the middle. It's about 12%. Problematic opiate use, you see, it's 2% in the United States. It's anywhere between 0.1 and 0.6% in Europe, and we're on the lower level here. And it's also important that heroin users are basically smoking heroin and not injecting heroin in the Netherlands. So that you have to take into account also when you look at overdose deaths. Opiate overdose deaths, say 200 per million. 19 per 100, 200 per million in the United States, 20 per million in Europe, and we are at about 6 per million in the Netherlands. Although we're increasing, we're still low. Proportion of fentanyl overdose deaths in opiate overdose deaths, which is a very important thing because that's the main issue now in the United States. Fentanyls, 46% currently in the United States, mainly illicitly manufactured fentanyl. In Europe, you see it's still very low, and we should be happy with that, but we should also be very careful. It's two things. One is diversion, and that's probably the situation, or was the situation in southern part of Germany, and illicitly manufactured fentanyls. In Holland, we haven't seen it, but maybe there is something unreported. People in opiate maintenance, agonist treatment, methadone, buprenorphine, and heroin treatment, you see it's in the US it's 13%, in Europe it's 48%, in the Netherlands it's about 52%. So what we see is actually quite large differences. And the question is, why, how can we explain these differences? And these are 3 papers. We were having the last paper on the issue, trying to explain these difference between North America and Europe. And one part is probably difference in regulations, like in Europe there's no advertisement of medication to the general public allowed. We have no pill mills. It's pharmacies mainly selling and dispensing opiate and painkillers. The market is quite different. It seems that there is some higher risk awareness among patients in Europe. We have a different insurance system, and the doctor is not being directly paid by patients or consumers, but so we might have a less need to satisfy our customers, our patient directly, and so we don't have to prescribe opiates if the patient really wants or demands it from us. There is good treatment available for people with an opiate dependence, so they don't have to go to other markets. Heroin is still in Europe relatively cheap and available, so they don't have to move to prescription opiates for their addiction. The prescribing of painkillers, opiate painkillers in Europe is quite complex, and we have a relatively good prescription monitoring system, prevent the doctor shopping, but I think the last speaker is going to talk about that. So for me, the conclusions, although with careful saying that, I think it is true, and I don't say it with a kind of nasty pleasure, but there is massive problems in the US and Canada. And until now, I think they weren't very intensively addressed, especially given the low access to opiate dependence treatments. But the HEAL program is hopefully going to change that. There is a large increase in the use of opiate painkillers in Europe, but without associated opiate-related problems and overall overdose deaths. So I think that is a relatively good message. But there is a large increase in overdose deaths in some European countries, but not in Europe as a whole. But that means that all countries, I think, should remain vigilant in their situation. I think Europe should continue or even expand their free-of-charge opiate agonist treatment. So let's not get opiophobic. Like there is a risk, but we should continue our good opiate maintenance programs. And Europe should also continue adequate pain relief for patients in need. So we should warn, we should be vigilant, but we shouldn't become opiophobic and start to not treat our pain patients not in the best way we can. Thank you very much.
Cette excellente présentation.
Thank you very much for that excellent presentation. Now we'll continue with Professor Nicolas Autier, who's going to tell us about the French situation. Thank you very much, Maurice.
Donc on va...
So we will continue now to talk about opioids and analgesic opioids and the French data following on from what has already been presented, particularly by Van den Brink about consumption trends. And I'll give you the results of a research study done by our team about the use and misuse of opioid analgesics in France. With use is the reimbursement of analgesic opioids in France. There's an increase of the number of patients treated in France because between 2004 and 2017, there's a slight reduction, as you can see on the graph. However, the prescription of other analgesics, paracetamol, have increased in this period. So what has happened in this period of time so that opioid analgesics have not increased but have in fact decreased? Well, you can see this on this curve, on the green curve here. There is a medication that was no longer marketed in 2002 and 11. It was stopped, and it's called dextropropoxyphene, and that was 14% of patients who had. There were some side effects, but not as much as what we are observing right now. And obviously, when this molecule was stopped, that consumption was not totally compensated, but other molecules did take its place. And so we had an increase multiplied by 2 or even 3 of some molecules like tramadol, codeine, and opium powder. These are all analgesics, but they're not comparable with regards to risks and notably potential abuse and dependency. Now, with regards to the strong opioids, as we call them, and on this slide, they have increased in France, but since they are a minority in terms of prescription, you cannot see that in the global consumption, which has been impacted by but we've gone to the blue curve is an increase of the strong opioid. Morphine is quite stable of green, but there's an increase of fentanyl, and then an increase, a significant increase, which follows the same global increase, which is oxycodone, which has come into the French market in the early 2000s, which has got a market share to become number 2 or number 3 of the strong opioids. Now, if we're looking at the strong opioids, this is a bit of a complicated graph, but I'll summarize it. The patient profiles that will be treated with strong opioids, well, we see that they are mostly used in pain not linked to cancer. They are efficient, they have to be prescribed, but we see them particularly in pain, non-cancer pain. And it is in this dimension that the prescriptions have increased most in that section. They've almost doubled with an increase of with an increase of 90% even in chronic non-cancer pain. And if we finish with this usage data in France in chronic pain not linked to cancer, and we look at the 3 main strong opioids in those patients without cancer with chronic pain, those that increase most are in terms of prescription is oxycodone. The figures impressive, 180%, but it started from very low, so it has to be taken into context. But this is explained by recommendations, by reimbursements that are authorized for pains not linked to cancer, lumbalgia, for example, neuropathic, and also arthrosis, osteoarthritis, and knee pain. Dr. Chopin was mentioned before. This is comparable here with analgesics, strong and weak, 56 they've had the shopping means they've been going to various different pharmacists or doctors. But if we look at the number of French people treated by those medications, it's underestimated undoubtedly, but it's at least 70,000 who have who shop around with, and therefore are possibly liable to abuse of the interest. And this affects young people mainly. We chose less than age 65, although normally in publications under 45, normally in a precarious or uncertain situation. And this is important for the reimbursement. The existence of cancer is also another associate factor. The existence of a mental disorder, the existence of a disorder in use of opioids or associated benzodiazepine. And this is situations of medical shopping, doctor shopping, and we see 3 times more risks of death among patients who have episodes of doctor shopping in a year, almost 3-4 times more risk of death. You cannot identify whether it's an overdose, but 3 if the patients are treated by high dosages of more than 150 milligrams equivalent of morphine per day. So there was a report to add to these data. I'll give you some brief data also, because I think Michel will be talking about that. There was one that has been published by the Medicine Agency this year, which gives you all the different data about addictovigilance, surveillance on all of these medicines, and the share of the declaration of undesirable effects linked to opioid analgesics increases every year. You can see the evolution in the red curve between 2006 to 2015. The 3 are morphine, tramadol, and with specificity an oxycodone, and but morphine specific because it's outside authorization use in France with substitution or with treatment of addiction to heroin. This exists, and so therefore that is associated to bigger risks, and therefore more important declarations with regards to affection. Now, if we look at the profile of the patients or the subject of the addictovigilance declaration in France, except for morphine, where it is more male and closer to drug users, it is mainly women otherwise, which is not surprising because mostly these patients have access to certain opioids because they have pain, and the prevalence of the chronic pain is more important among populations of women. The range of women, this is an estimate between the different molecules, between 40 and 50 years. This is a little bit higher than the profile for drug users. And we find that in at least 30 to 45% of cases, there are psychiatric comorbidities, and this is a risk factor of the misuse of the opioid analgesics. And these are abuse or misuse. This was a survey based on addictovigilance on fake prescriptions, and there's a greater proportion of analgesic opioids in the taken to the agency with 3 medicines, mainly tramadol, codeine, number 2, and in 3rd place, morphine. Deaths, I'll go very quickly through this, but Michel will be talking about this, but there's a survey that exists from Grenoble that tells us that tramadol in France is the first molecule implemented in involved in deaths associated with analgesics, and then morphine, and then codeine. So tramadol is the molecule is the most prescribed in France, of course, but it had the image of a safe molecule, but doesn't seem to be the case with these figures. And in the national database, there are cases of overdose that have been reported, which are mortal or not, or all the notices are collected here. And you can see the evolution of the number of cases given to the annual rate of notifications to pharmacovigilance. And you can see that between 2005 and 2006, these declarations, there's been an increase of tramadol plus 139%, and oxycodone was plus 1,229, but we started very, very low. There were very few prescriptions at first, but they both have increased. Morphine is more or less stable, and opium powder has increased because the market, there are new medicines that have come back to the market since 2015 with opium powder, and there's an average age, mostly of women, of 73 years. Hospitalizations because of overdose with opioids in France, quite apart from the emergency. This means people who are actually hospitalized. This coincides with what Wim said. There's an increase of plus 167% of overdoses linked to prescribed opioids other than methadone and other than heroin, which is not prescribed in France yet. In green, you can see the heroin. Methadone is red, and so it's increasing also in France. Therefore, you can see that there was not necessarily more patients treated by different. If we look at the deaths, these data are not complete, but this is a French database, which is the CPIDC, which tells you the trends of deaths per year linked to opioids, and there you can see an increase of 146%, which gives us an estimate of about 200 patients per year in 2015, which is an underestimation, which is not always very reliable with regards to the identified cause, but we've excluded from that data everything that was intentional overdose in a suicide context, for example, and methadone and heroin. And I'm going to finish now with a little note on tramadol. It's the number one of prescribed in France. Almost 7 million France, and number two of complications that have been declared of pharmacodependence, of drug dependence. And it's particularly a risk when there's substitution of heroin. Number one of overdose with or without death. More than 25% of the complications are linked to withdrawal syndrome, even after a few weeks of treatment with tramadol. So withdrawal, the significance is not just opioid, and the question of tramadol, should we continue in France as a first intention medicine, because it's not necessarily the most safe. I'm not saying it's not efficient. Perhaps it's not quite as safe as other opioid analgesics. And now to finish, two slides about the main messages that come out of these French data. There's no health crisis of opioids in France, and there isn't one in Europe either, even though in some countries, like, for example, Scotland, are more worrying, but it is an avoidable risk, however, and therefore it is important to prevent it. We've seen that in the United States, millions or hundreds of millions of euros have been unblocked in order to do research because there was a crisis. It would be good for there to be a few million that would be unblocked in France in order to prevent a crisis by caring for additions, and also by improving the care for chronic pain, because if we don't improve that care, which is necessary in France, then we can also end up to non-conventional use or over-treatment or treatment that is too quick with analgesic opioids. We have to ensure proper accessibility and try to develop new treatment for pain, but that's slow, as you know, and we have to be careful because we're talking more and more of other molecules like pregabalin, for example. Pregabalin particularly, that is gabapentinoid. These are combos, oxidone, pregabalin in first care. So that pregabalin plus opioid increases the risk of opioid, and it has been more described in order to do withdrawal, sometimes in methadone, sometimes with benzodiazepine. But be careful with the prescriptions here together with methadone. Now, to finish, the last slide, we mustn't harm by not prescribing an opioid analgesic if the patient needs it, if they have a pain that proposes, but you have to choose the right and correctly, and sometimes strong opioid analgesic can be more safer than a weaker one, particularly if there's a high dose, and also you mustn't prescribe it for too long by not respecting the risk factors of misuse, and therefore you have to screen for that misuse constantly in order to ensure a good accessibility and good care for pain in the future. Thank you.
Merci, Nicolas.
Thank you very much, Nicolas. You've left us a few minutes to give the floor to Michel Malaret to talk about the drug surveillance system in France, the addictovigilance system in France. Thank you. I'll try to show you the contribution of drug surveillance, particularly for the opioid crisis. What are the clinical implications with regards to this? So, this is the DNA of the network, and it is exchanges that have to be bilateral in order to try and get information, to exchange that information in order to get better detail about what is really happening in France. And so, therefore, as notifications are not sufficient, it is important to have all of these follow-ups and controls, looking at the prescriptions, the fake prescriptions, secure prescriptions or less good prescriptions, the data of surveys with the SCAPA. This is the monitoring center for addict patients, and finally the data from the insurance. These exchanges are important in order to compare data, to assess, and also to propose new measures. Not to overdo things like salvinorin, which doesn't cause major problems, but kratom and fentanyl. And always inform. And what are the different data that we have to debate for this information, for this exchange between the addictologist and the survey? Well, these are the aspects that we can find with these problems. And, for example, to begin with clinical cases where you can work. I'll take this example of this patient that is taking methadone and has hypoglycemia, symptomatic hypoglycemia. Should we make a particular examination because there's no so there are cases of a hypoglycemia, but there's not enough data in order to be able to modify the information, and so there's a vicious circle. We can't see that cases can appear, but there can be. It's not very frequent, but it can happen with 40 milligrams, and so it is known that hypoglycemia is favored by opioids because it reduces the androgenic response. And so it is true that we have to know this information in order to work with it, and even in the mortality with methadone, we have to consider that hypoglycemia may have participated in that mortality. Second, clinical case that can be interesting. This is a case we know well for methadone. Can also take to and oxytolone can increase the space. It's important to gather the information and to, among the cases that you pointed out, the primary addiction, for example, and the cases of secondary addiction after consumption of heroin, it is important to have this information, and probably this delay in the situation, the differentiation between primary and secondary, means that we get the information late, and the phenomenon is described too late. And though we find in the SCAPA that there are more and more patients who are cared for, and this showed that the problem has been underestimated in the past. Now, for the old substances, we have new problems. Volcodeine, well, we don't have any explanations of why people die with volcodeine. We don't have enough clinical evidence in order to give details about why this is happening and why this leads to some deaths and why there is this abuse that leads to mortality. And also currently in France, there was, of course, a significant share of MSO use for heroin substitution, for example. And in other countries, you have to know that the kratom, this plant, can be used as an alternative to MSO and can increase to the extent that in the United States that there are 91 tests that are attributed to this opioid agonist, and it is a possible participant in the crisis, but exists. And even it's a field study in France that shows that the notifications increase, and there are cases of abuse of kratom in France, which may be participating in abuse of opioids. And also in France, even if the importance is not so important as the United States, there are fentanyloids, synthetic, produced in an illicit way, and you can see that there are some cases where, in spite of the research by various different laboratories, we don't find the substance that is responsible for the opioid coma. And finally, we discover that it is a very potent fentanyloid, because it is 1,000 more powerful than and the mortal dose is much lower in volume and in weight than that of heroin. So the data of mortality in France are still fairly imprecise, and we have talked about CPDC, but there are no psychological analysis at hospitals. There are a few cases because people are revived in hospital, but and so it was important to have information about deaths in the cases of the use of analgesics, which leads to death. Either if it's involuntary or with suicide outside a context of addiction. So the estimate, which is old already, of the number of deaths per addicted patients was 1,175 deaths, which is quite close to the European average, which is between 10 and 16 deaths per million people. And we must know that this data is linked to the fact that in France, the agency does not detect all the deaths linked to the substance because there isn't a systematic analysis of all patients as occurs in Finland, for example. So there's probably a bias because it was only a part of the cases of death, but globally the data is quite consistent over time because we have an evolution which is quite regular and there's no major difference with the different years. And we benefit of a systematic analysis of autopsies and this is quite determinant. But unfortunately, because of the absence and because it is anonymous, there's no knowledge of the trajectory or the previous patient prescription, so you don't know if the substance was prescribed or whether it had been obtained in an illicit manner. And if you look at the deaths that occurred in 2017, the data is relatively stable in the end, but you can see that among the deaths in 2017, then the vast majority of these deaths are associated to opioids. And an important share is linked to methadone because finally that is the substance that leads to the greatest number of deaths among opioids. And whilst heroin really has a lower number and morphine is that a little bit less again. And if there are cases of fentanyloids or others, the number is low. Perhaps there's an underestimation because the labs may not detect it, but probably nevertheless it is a low number for the other substances. But in spite of all of these biases that we know, because it's not complete, that there are probably differences between the reality and the data and the treated patients and the deaths, and the data of the heroin users are relatively imprecise, but in 2013 there were a large number of 107,000 active users estimated in 2013. And we can see that the frequency of deaths with all of these biases that we have to bear in mind would be of 2.7 deaths per 1,000 patients under methadone, or 0.32 deaths per 1,000 patients with PhD. It's a significant difference because we know that this is a partial antagonist. It's very difficult to compare with morphine, which is largely used in the substitution. And it is true also that if there were more than 10,000 morphine addicts, substitution, but often with injections, well, you could think that the mortality would be lower to that of methadone, and also if there are 30,000 heroin addicts, the mortality associated with heroin would be lower than that associated to methadone. It's difficult to go further in this subject, but we have to remember all of this and see how we could try to reduce these risks. Notably, the question of methadone is whether the medicine is prescribed or obtained in the black market. And thanks to the Opioid survey that you do when you participate in this survey done by the SVPs, we realize through this survey that methadone is obtained illegally in 12% of the cases among patients that come to the XAPA agency, and to greater, because the most serious cases are just 9%. We can see that this illegal obtention of methadone can also be a reason for a death before care is done by specialized centers. Care is given by specialized centers. Since we don't have very precise data about that, because we don't know whether it was obtained in the black market or whether it was prescribed, you have to have prescription. You have to have prevention with reasonable prescription that is controlled and monitored, also to try and reduce the black market, so that there is not that methadone and other substances shouldn't be easily accessible, and faster care of patients in specialized centers and addictologists. What is also interesting in the deaths, we can try and calculate it by thousands of inhabitants. There are areas we see that there are many more deaths, and this can be significant. For example, in rural areas like La Somme or Haute-Loire, where you can see the arrows, is it because they have a more efficient analysis of drugs, and so or maybe there is also less medical care in those regions, and the addiction experts, it's not so easy to have access there, and that may be that there may be reinforced prevention in areas where accessibility to substitution medicines is less significant. And now when we look, and this has been mentioned before, about the data of mortality for with analgesics, with opioid medicines, we can see that there is an increase of the deaths with tramadol, and also a slightly lesser increase also with morphine. But we particularly can see that there's an increase of deaths with oxycodone, which can be worrying, and which therefore justifies more prevention work with it. And what is also important is, I think, the prevention of mortality, and so therefore there must be more dissemination information for naloxone in order to have that prevention, which is absolutely necessary. And to show you also the importance of the interactions between drug surveillance and addictologues, I will give you some clinical cases that have arisen which justify this relation between the surveillance and the addiction specialists. This was notified to our colleagues in the city of Nantes, who tried to determine what was happening in that region to explain this situation, which was of libido, which was important, whereas generally in France there are a few cases, and for reasons of reimbursements, the patients were much more obliged in the end to receive the generic medicine, and so the majority of libidos arise because of the injection of the generic medicine. But this made us do some studies in Nantes, which showed that there was a presence of silicon in these injuries that came from excipients that were present in the generic buprenorphine, which is not present otherwise. So it was the opportunity and this relationship between the addiction specialist and the addiction center showed that the harmful effects was a problem, and in the end it led to one of the serious harmful consequences for patients, and this led to allowing the suppression of excipients and therefore reduction of the notified cases of libido, and the frequency, therefore, the notified frequency has been reduced. As a conclusion, we can see that these exchanges between addictologues and addictos surveillance is important in spite of the relative difference between what is happening in France and the United States. And we can see that we have to remain vigilant for methadone, morphine, heroin, for abuse and risk of mortality, and there are an early sign, and it is important not to be late making observations of complications, and so it is important, thanks to these exchanges, to have a panoply of solutions and better understand what is happening in order to have a better vision of the whole. And so prevention is important, and you nevertheless have to hope, for example, with without being too optimistic, and I thank you for listening.
Merci Michel. On va.
Thank you, Michel. We'll just take a few minutes now just to make a few comments about all the different presentations. If there's nobody in the room has a question, or I have one, and I would like to have a question which allow us to look at the different aspects all at once. We're very impressed, Yvon, by the investment that has been made now by the American government for the care of this crisis of opioids. We can see that there's a considerable number of molecules that have appeared with many sophisticated things. But the question is, today, are we also, all the provisions of access, for example, to have medicines is one thing, but to allow people to benefit from them, that's even better, I would say. And to stay, we can see even for the substitution, the coverage in the US is reasonably low compared to Europe. So how do we promote all of this pharmacology, but particularly how do we make it available to those people who most need it? And also, I would ask you to comment. You can see that today and a few years ago, many people didn't believe of the evolution of an American-type crisis in Europe, and we can see that it can happen, and we can see that there are signals because we're not complete enough. Perhaps the Americans are better than us for the assessment of the processes, and it is a process that evolves very quickly. You can see we're always a bit late in evolution to have a system of surveillance which will allow us to have that vigilance and to set up adapted measures. So Wim, in what you showed us, where there are clearly places in Europe like Scotland or Germany, there you can clearly see that the evolution is not necessarily anticipated a few years ago. How can we explain that there are elements of similarities between the two countries which can explain that evolution? And apart from Europe, you can see that there are differences within a country, as Michel, because there can be an epidemiology that depends on the particular ecology in a particular region that changes the data.
Wow. So to answer the first part of your question, Maurice, I think I agree with you. We can have all the science and we can have all the medications, but if the health system is not responding to address the issue, then we are not going to have any impact. So, you know, it's a political issue. In the United States, there is a movement right now towards more like individualized approaches instead of more like social approaches, as we all know. So the idea of in Europe having most countries having a public health system that supports the treatment of all individuals, I think makes a big difference. In the United States, one of the problems that we have is that, and the trend is moving towards more health insurance, private health insurance, and less of this type of public health system. So the access to treatment is very, very limited. And we have something that, when I mentioned this to colleagues in Europe, they can't believe that there are waiting lists for example, for methadone treatment. People that can, even having insurance, they can have access to treatment, or for buprenorphine, or the limitations that exist for treatment of buprenorphine. So the health system is unfortunately designed in a way that, in my view, is not going. we can have all this research, but it's not going to, it's not helping to, or that could help even more to address this opioid crisis. So we had a different system with more public health, more prescription monitoring, for example, more electronic health records that can anyone have and better access to treatment. I think the situation would be very, very different. So that's kind of my politically correct response, okay? Well, the other question was, what was the exhaustivity of the information. Seems that oh, yes. A very nice database. Yeah, I think, well, what I see the contrast between the United States and Europe is the quality of the information. So I think that we have a big difference. I think we can see that Vin's presentation is pulling data from different places and trying to make a story. And France has systems, but I think the data that we have in the US is quite strong, although it's not as good as data that especially have in countries where they have the public health system and there is data more comprehensive about the quality of the nature and the quality of care. But I think having this data is very useful in terms of the pharmacovigilance and being able to monitor the evolution of this epidemic. I also think that one of the things that perhaps was not mentioned here was part of the issue in the US with fentanyl, which is causing most of the deaths associated with opioids right now, is a market factor. And there is a big influx of illegal fentanyl that is very cheap, that the claim is that it's coming from China, is very, very cheap. And so drug dealers are mixing the heroin with fentanyl, and fentanyl is 1,000 times more potent than morphine. So people are using what they think is morphine, but it's illegally laced with fentanyl, and then they are not prepared to address fentanyl overdose. And the other reason is that many people that entered into this opioid epidemic entered via the prescription opioid use. So they are not the professional drug addicts that were in the streets that know more pharmacology than us. They know how to monitor their doses of heroin. Those are relatively naive people that when they couldn't get their prescription opioids, they went and started buying heroin, and that heroin was laced with fentanyl, and that caused their death. So I think that's a big factor. Perhaps the market has not come into Europe with this type of fentanyl. That's my theory, and that may be the reason why you don't have that. Perhaps the places where they see the fentanyl peaks is because markets, or there are some dealers that are getting into those markets. That's
why we need pragmatic strategies.
Right.
Yeah, I fully agree with that. As far as we can see now, there is not a lot of illicit fentanyl on the European market, with the emphasis on markets. And I think that it has been described a few times in the journal Addiction already. They say in the near future there will be no heroin anymore, because heroin, you know, it is a natural product or a semi-synthetic product, and the production is dependent on situation and countries where there is war, there is insecurity. Then you have to traffic it, and it's quite bulky. And so if you think about organized crime, that fentanyl or carfentanil is so much easier to produce. You're not dealing with unstable governments. You're not dealing with complex trafficking. You're not dealing with bulky substances that are being caught easily. So there are people who think that within the coming years, heroin will not be the illicit drug anymore, but it will be one of these fentanyls, or many of these fentanyls, and we have to hope that that will not happen, or that consumers, patients, are getting better aware. But as you said, now it's mixed with heroin, or mixed with cocaine, actually. And that makes it for users very, very risky and unpredictable. So the only place now that we see it really is in Estonia. And, but I think we have to be very careful. And with regard to the data, I think it's amazing how little, I was searching for the EMCDDA. Actually, the EMCDDA is made to collect all this international information. But if I see what I can find about the Netherlands, it's almost nothing, and we could collect the data. If we can see what you can collect in France, it's more than you can find in the EMCDDA data. So there's really a call for EMCDDA to have a better and closer monitoring together with the local organizations or the national organizations to get better data, because we do have reasonable local data, but they're not integrated on the European level. At least not to the detail that we actually use in this developing epidemic, or maybe not epidemic, but it's. I think we would like to have these data better coordinated.